Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. So continuing our discussion about antibiotics, and after we completed the cell wall inhibitors and the protein synthesis inhibitors, now we are going to talk about the antibiotics that affect the bacterial DNA, and those are the quinolones. So the quinolones arose in the early 1960s in form of the nalidixic acid, and in this video we will talk about the quinolones generations, and beside that let's start. So let's start by talking about the generations in general, then we are going to talk about each generation separately in more details. And finally, we had a comparison table that we are going to summarize the information in. So regarding the generations in general, we have 4 different generations from the quinolones, starting with the first generation, which we have only one drug in this generation, which is the nalidixic acid. So nalidixic acid, which arose or discovered in the early 1960s, and after the first generation we had the second generation, and we get the second generation after adding a fluorine molecule, a fluorine atom, into the structure of the first generation. We get the second generation in form of the norfloxacin and the ciprofloxacin. And then after the second generation, the third generation arose in form of the levofloxacin. So levofloxacin, and after that we have the fourth generation in form of the moxifloxacin and the gemifloxacin. So all of those drugs have the fluorine molecule in, except for the nalidixic acid. So all of those are called the fluoroquinolones, except for the nalidixic acid, and each generation have characteristics which are different from the other generations in form of the pharmacokinetics and the spectrum, and we are going to discuss those in the next slides. So let's start by talking about the first generation. So regarding the first generation, we have the nalidixic acid only in this generation. Regarding the important points in the pharmacokinetics of the first generation or of the nalidixic acid, so the nalidixic acid doesn't attain significant plasma concentration, so doesn't attain significant plasma concentration, and it is excreted in urine quickly and excreted quickly through urine, and it is in the active form. And also the nalidixic acid don't cross the blood-brain barrier, or doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. Regarding the spectrum of the nalidixic acid, so it mostly works on the gram negatives, so mostly works on gram negatives, And regarding the therapeutic uses, it is used to treat urinary tract infections in general. So because the naldixic acid work on the gram-negatives, and it also excreted quickly through urine in high concentrations and in the active form. So those two characteristics make it perfect for treating urinary tract infections. And it does not work on systemic infections because it does not attain significant plasma concentration. So it does not work on infection. It is not very effective in treating any other infection other than the urinary tract infections. Now let's talk about the second generation. And in the second generation, we have two drugs. We have the norfloxacin and the ciprofloxacin. Regarding important points in the pharmacokinetics of the second generation, so pharmacokinetics, the second generation does attain significant plasma concentration. So does attain significant plasma concentration, and this is the opposite of the first generation. And it does attain significant plasma concentration with a half-life of 3 hours for the norfloxacin and 4 hours for the ciprofloxacin, plus the post-antibiotic effect, because those drugs also accumulate in the neutrophils and they have post-antibiotic effect added to their half-life. And also in the pharmacokinetics, this generation crosses the blood-brain barrier in case of meningitis. So cross blood-brain barrier and achieve therapeutic levels in case of meningitis. And it is also excreted in urine in the active form. So excreted in urine in active form. Now regarding the spectrum is also, they work mostly on the gram-negatives, same with the first generation, but the ciprofloxacin covers some resistant organisms such as the Pseudomonas. So cipro covers Pseudomonas and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So Pseudomonas and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And regarding the uses of the second generation, the therapeutic uses, it is used to treat urinary tract infections for the same reasons, because it works on the gram-negatives and it is excreted in urine in the active form. And it is also used to treat systemic infections, because it does attain significant plasma concentration, so it could work on any systemic infections caused by a gram-negative microorganism. Now let's talk about the third generation, and we have the levofloxacin as the third generation of the quinolones. And important points in the pharmacokinetics of the levofloxacin, it has an 8-hour half-life plus the post-antibiotic effect and it also across the blood-brain barrier in good concentrations, and it has a good penetration to bones and joints. So good penetration to bones and joints, same as the clindamycin. So good penetration to bones and joints. The spectrum, this time the levofloxacin is going to work on the gram positives better than the gram negatives. So gram positives better than the gram negatives, and it also works on the atypical microorganisms. So atypical microorganisms. Regarding the therapeutic uses of the levofloxacin, it is used to treat respiratory tract infections, and it is very famous for that. Even it is this generation and the fourth generation, so the third and fourth generation of the quinolones is called the respiratory fluoroquinolones. So respiratory fluoroquinolones, because it is used to treat respiratory infections. It is also used to treat meningitis because it has good crossing, good penetration to blood-brain barrier, and it is used to treat osteomyelitis because it has good penetration to bones and joints. Also, the third generation does attain significant plasma concentration, and this applies to the fourth generation also. For the quinolones, all of them attain good plasma concentration except for the naldexic acid, which form the first generation. Now let's talk about the fourth generation of the quinolones. We have two drugs in this generation. We have the gemifloxacin and the moxifloxacin. Regarding important points in the pharmacokinetics of the fourth generation, so pharmacokinetics, we have 8 hours half-life for the gemifloxacin and 12 hours of half-life for the moxifloxacin, plus the post-antibiotic effect for both of these drugs. And they have excellent penetration to the blood-brain barrier. So excellent penetration to blood-brain barrier, and they have good penetration to bones, and the moxifloxacin is excreted in the bile. So moxi excreted in bile, so it is not used to treat urinary tract infections, not for UTIs. Regarding the spectrum of the fourth generation, it also covers the gram positives better than the gram negatives, but it does cover some gram negatives, same with the other generations, and it covers the atypical microorganisms and it covers the anaerobes. Regarding the therapeutic uses of the fourth generation, it is also used to treat respiratory tract infections, and it is one of the respiratory fluoroquinolones, and it covers, or it's treat the meningitis because it has excellent penetration to the blood-brain barrier, and it is used to treat the osteomyelitis because it has good penetration to the bones. Finally, we have this table as a comparison between the different generations of the quinolones. On this row, we have the generations, and in the column, we have the agents, we have the comparison points, we have the agents, the half-life, CSF levels, the spectrum, and the uses. For the first generation, we have the naldixic acid in the agents, and the second generation, we have the norfloxacin and the cipro. On the third, we have the levo. On the fourth, we have the gemi and the moxi. For the half-life, we have the first generation 3 hours, but it does not attain significant plasma concentration. For the second generation, we have the 3 hours for the norfloxacin and 4 hours for the cipro, and plus the post-antibiotic effect. For the third generation, we have 8 hours for the levo, plus the post-antibiotic effect, and for the fourth generation, 8 hours for the gemi and 12 hours for the moxi. CSF levels for the first generation, it is negligible. For the second generation, is good during meningitis. For the third generation, it is good in general, and for the fourth, it is excellent. For the spectrum, the first generation covers gram-negatives only. Second generation covers mostly gram-negatives, but some gram-positives. For the third generation, it covers gram-positives better than the gram-negatives, and it does also cover the atypical microorganisms. And for the fourth generation, it covers gram-positives, negatives, atypical microorganisms, and anaerobes. And finally, regarding the uses, the first generation is used exclusively to treat urinary tract infections. The second generation used for UTIs and systemic infections caused by gram-negatives. And third generation used for respiratory tract infections, osteomyelitis, meningitis, and same for the fourth generation used for RTIs, osteomyelitis, and meningitis. And with that, we reach the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and see you in the next video. Peace.